I want to ask you something. So you mentioned that I know we want to move on to some of the things you're working on now, but just for clarification, because again, the United States, we don't get a lot of discussion about these things in the media. So Gaza, you mentioned, was basically a refugee camp from the initial 1948 Nakba. So this was when Ergon, Haganah, these were Jewish paramilitary groups, came in and cleared the land out for the settlers. And this is pretty much where they landed. I want you to elaborate for a second on the fact that they can't leave. So people need to understand that the people in Gaza that have been there for several generations now are stuck there. They can't leave by sea because they will get killed. They can't leave by land. I think there's one exit to Egypt, one into Israel. Both are heavily guarded. So it's a prison. I mean, how is this not a prison? So how does that get rectified, and how can they pretend that it's something other than what it's not? Because it seems that that's the case. If you bring this up to anybody that's like strongly Zionist, they have a million different ways in which they try to justify what's happening in Gaza, and I just don't see how it's justifiable.
What I refuse to justify is giving any legitimacy to their forms of the justifications, rather than just telling them, to get real or to get out of here. So basically, if people were able to flee Gaza, they would do it over the past 7 days.
Exactly.
There are bombs raining on Gaza. People are hiding. Basically, they have literally nowhere left to hide. I have personal friends in Gaza. They are obviously their homes have been bombed. And partly damaged. They are finding refuge wherever they can, which is mostly schools and hospitals. The hospital compound, the gardens of the hospital, and there's masses of people there. We also have to remember that there's COVID, there's rampant cases like COVID going on, and this in itself, if you add that to everything that we talked about, think about what that means in the sense of Israel's responsibility for the welfare of the people of Gaza. Not only that they deny them the vaccination that they have plenty of, they also basically do everything in their power to directly and indirectly kill these people. So people are finding refuge, if you can call that refuge, at the compound of the hospital or the schools, and praying that these will not be bombed. I know that Israel actually notified the UN that they will bomb a couple of such hospitals, etc. I know that I believe that it was about 13 hospitals that were bombed in the previous assault on Gaza. I don't know. I don't want to say numbers that I don't remember exactly, but the vast majority of hospitals have been at least damaged, if not ruined. And we can go on and on about that. Like these were targeted. I mean, Israel has precision weapons. They are targeting these facilities
intentionally.
Intentionally, definitely, intentionally.
Ronnie,
also, everything is being surveilled by drones, etc. And this leads us to what I'm doing here in the UK.
It's just, this is just wild. It's terrible. And before we get to, I have one more question for you about this before we get to what you're doing in the UK. So recently, Netanyahu, who is a parliamentary form of government, so they have to build a coalition. He's trying to stay in power. He welcomed back Kahanas into the party, and I don't know that a lot of Americans understand how absolutely insane that is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. I'll give you the long answer, if I may.
Please, yes, because I think this is a really important part of the conversation, because it really exemplifies how far gone the Likud government really is, and how deeply insular they are, that they don't understand how detrimental that is.
Yeah. So as far as I'm aware, there are only two types of Zionism: the honest Zionists, which are racist and proud of it, and the more racist, the more honest they are, by the way, less trying to hide behind niceties, some sort of a humanistic or liberal discourse. And then you have the other type of Zionism, which is the self-proclaimed liberal Zionism, Peter Beinart and all that lot. And they come up with a whole other discourse which tries to sugarcoat Zionism, which tries to sugarcoat that deeply racist, supremacist character of that state and society. Unfortunately, the society is very much in support of what the state does and represents. They are maybe critical to a certain degree about the military occupation of '67, but other than that, they like their cherished, artificially created Jewish majority very much. And these are the only types of Zionists that I know. What we see today and over the past decades is kind of what is regarded as fascization, becoming more fascist, of the Zionist, of the Israeli society and government. We see it becoming more right-wing, extreme right, extreme right, etc. Or, as the way I would put it, they're just becoming more honest. They're just unapologetic about their Zionism. And obviously, you know, at the extreme, you have those that you mentioned, Kahana Chai or Kahana, whatever they're called these days, Ben-Gvir and the others. And Netanyahu, for different political reasons, he chose to bring them on board because he's trying to save the seat. He doesn't want to go into this legal battle that is awaiting him in Israeli courts for corruption and other things. Now, this is basically all I see in this transformation. There is no transformation of anything. There's just becoming less apologetic, less kind of Zionism, which is in your face. Well, traditionally, historically, the left wing, the so-called left wing, because there is no left in Israel, so-called left wing, these self-proclaimed liberal Zionists, they were in power. The Labor Party, etc. And then there was some shift happening, and they lost power, and also they have become less and less relevant and definitely less dominant. By the way, to use the term leftist in Israel is a slur. It is a derogatory term. And using human rights arguments, so just saying the term human rights is like, cursing. And I mean it, literally. In many,
no, I know.
In many circles.
Seen the videos.
In many circles, yes.
Yeah.
Now, and this is what I'm saying, that Israel is just becoming more and more what it actually is. So we have less of the facade of normality and liberalism and so on. This facade is what I'm trying to challenge for decades now. This facade is basically every single article that was ever published on Haaretz newspaper, which I see as the leading tool of Zionist propaganda. It is every article that was published on the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this facade is kind of breaking, and now we are coming to see kind of the true face, in a way, of Israel. I want to tell you something about Israeli society. As these events are unfolding in Gaza and East Jerusalem, etc., occupied Jerusalem, we have people roaming the streets in Israel who are carrying weapons. They are many times walking escorted by Israeli police, and this is all documented. And they are, for example, throwing Molotov cocktails into Palestinian homes in Jaffa.
Wow.
I know that they went to Lid, occupied, ethnically cleansed Lid, now called Lod. I should mention that the airport, which is Tel Aviv airport, it's not in Tel Aviv, it's in ethnically cleansed Lid. That very spot of the airport was cleansed. These people went to Lid again, armed, etc., and they basically designated roles to each group, and they went and they were marking homes and cars of Palestinians, and in the attempt to obviously do something about that later on, when they're less visible, maybe under the guise of darkness, etc. We have these cases. By the way, we documented these in the previous assault on Gaza in 2014. We were kind of infiltrating, in a way, these Zionist demonstrations, far-right demonstrations. And I remember, I can share with you a video where you have these Israeli demonstrators walking in the streets of East Jerusalem, stopping cars and checking whether the driver is Arab or not, and with the intention to beat up these drivers. Luckily, they didn't find an Arab driver that evening, at least during that time when we were walking and filming them. These are expressions of Zionism. They are not rotten apples. They are not, something that is kind of outside of the sphere of the Zionist discourse. They are what I call more honest Zionists. And these are the consequences of establishing and establishing a race state and having a whole society basically being educated in that race state on these racial principles. I would say that the Zionist race state, I compare it to the KKK. The only difference is that in the US, the KKK was quite mainstream at the time. We know about Trump's father, for example. We know about the KKK marching the streets of New York, etc. But it is no longer legal or advisable to be part of that white supremacist organization. There is a constitution, not a great constitution in the US, but nonetheless, you do have a constitution. There is some basis. Slavery is not legal. It hasn't been abolished. It is only migrated into the prison industrial complex, and Michelle Alexander talks about that, and on and on. So, but on the face of it, there is some basis for equality that you can build upon, and I wish you luck. At the same time, the exact opposite applies to Israel. There is no basis of equality, and there can never be a basis of equality. The basis is that we started with, that I am privileged by law. Not because I regard myself as Israeli or Jewish. I don't care about these things. I'm a human being. That's more than enough for me. I don't regard myself as Israeli or Jewish. I really couldn't care less about these issues. These terminologies. But this is my legal status in that state, and that can never change as long as it remains a race state. And the moment that will change, obviously, it will have to become one form or another of a democracy. So when you have such a race state, and you have people educated in such a race state, these are the consequences, and there cannot be any other consequences to that.